Europe's energy crisis did not begin with Russian tanks crossing into Ukraine. It began years earlier in boardrooms, summit halls, and climate manifestos where ambitions outran realism. Through sweeping green reforms, most notably the Germans' Energiewende, Europe, led by Germany, made a calculated gamble. Nuclear plants were shut down and coal has been put on death row. Reliable domestic power was sacrificed at the altar of intermittent renewables. The theory was elegant, but the execution was absolutely reckless, and by 2021, over half of Germany's gas supply flowed from Russia. Strategic dependence wasn't creeping in quietly into the EU, it was being engineered from the inside. And in 2018, at the United Nations General Assembly, then US President Donald Trump warned Germany that it was becoming totally controlled by Russia through projects like Nord Stream.
But Germany is totally controlled by Russia.
Critics, of course, laughed it off, but history proved him right. And if we fast forward to 2022, Russia's war on Ukraine exposed these flaws, forcing hasty pivot riddled with contradictions and new risks. And when Russia invaded Ukraine, Europe's moralism collided with physical reality. Gas prices exploded and heavy industry buckled, and chemical plants and fertilizer producers scaled down or shut down entirely. And this is when the scrambles for alternatives began. The irony was impossible to miss, though. Brussels has scolded member states that sought slower transitions or alternative bilateral agreements, framing energy policy as a test of unity and values. Yet when crisis struck, the EU embraced the very tools it once frowned upon. Global LNG bidding wars, Middle Eastern contracts, and Caucasus diplomacy, and geopolitical pragmatism. Energy security, it seems, ultimately boils down to supply, reliability, and economic reality. Not illusions, and certainly not principles. Azerbaijan became a key alternative. In 2022, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen signed a deal to double Azerbaijani gas imports by 2027, presenting it as an emancipation from Moscow. The detail that few people advertised, though, was that Azerbaijan increased its export partly by importing Russian gas for domestic consumption, freeing its own gas for Europe. This indirectly keeps Russian energy in the European market through a relabeled detour. This is called normative inconsistency. The EU pushes for complete exclusion of Russian energy while negotiating expansions that sustain indirect links. Meanwhile, American LNG became Europe's emergency oxygen tank. It stabilized supplies, yes it did, but at a cost. The LNG market is volatile, commercial, and tethered to U.S. domestic politics. In 2022, gas prices multiplied several times over. Energy-intensive industries bled, households absorbed the shock, and businesses went bankrupt. Replacing one dependency with another is not sovereignty or independence, nor is it a good idea. And many warned early that this diversification should precede decarbonization, and those warnings were bluntly dismissed. When reality intruded, though, the pivot was abrupt and it was costly. The bill landed where it always does, on citizens and on industry. And this exposes a core dilemma: the tension between the EU's so-called value-based normative foreign policy and pragmatic supply security needs in a multipolar world. Today, this crisis evolves beyond energy. In a February 2026 speech at the Munich Security Conference, Ursula von der Leyen called for bringing the EU's Mutual Defense Clause, Article 42, to life, emphasizing it's not optional, but an obligation. She invoked the one for all for one, urging a shift from unanimity to qualified majority voting in foreign policy to speed up decisions and avoid vetoes. This comes amid plans to accelerate Ukraine's EU membership by 2027, potentially triggering the clause if conflict persists, raising fears of deeper entanglement with Russia. Critics see this as risking acceleration, while supporters argue it's essential for European sovereignty in uncertain times. A new Europe is taking shape, and it is not the Europe of cooperation. It is not the Europe of sovereign nations working in concert, but a Europe consolidating power, steadily eroding national vetoes, centralizing authority, and redefining sovereignty as an obstacle rather than a principle. Von der Leyen said it herself, there's no other choice in a lawless world of raw power. She speaks of independence in defense, economy, technology, energy, but make no mistake, this independence, it means that Brussels becomes the raw power, overrunning its own member states, one for all and all forced to obey Brussels. A superstate where unanimity is portrayed as weakness and national vetoes are framed as sabotage. Dissidence is already having a hard time in the European Union, and now this will be disloyalty. These are people that are not listening when people heed warning, as they did before this energy crisis, dismissing people with concerns, real concerns. And when dependence deepened, critics were bluntly ignored. Now the solution is not reflection, it is acceleration. The irony cuts even deeper. Europe's vulnerability was not imposed from the outside, it was engineered internally, and the only true path to European independence is to undo the very policies that made us vulnerable in the first place, through ambitious green policies that dismantle reliable energy before secure alternative existed. Strategic exposure was created in the name of virtue, and now the same institutions argue that only more power, more consolidation can fix what those decisions broke? True independence does not come from concentrating authority in Brussels. It comes from resilient economies, diverse energy sources, competitive industry, sovereign flexibility. And if Europe truly wants strength, it must reverse the policies that made it fragile in the first place. Just know that history is not kind to overreach, and you need to wake up because the clock is ticking. The price of delay always appears on your bill. And soon, perhaps, that will be on the battlefield.